So this week, we're going to take a look at a favorite red ink in the community. This is Diamine Oxblood. Now what we have here is the 80ml glass bottle. For a bottle that only sets a person back $15, I think it's a really good value, and it has a really good shape with that vintage inkwell feel. Now over here, we have the little brother. Obviously they're not the same ink, but there are a couple key differences I want to look at. Sure, the one on the right is sub $10, but it's a royal pain to fill a pen from. I mean, you can see here from this TWSBI-inspired pen that the body is pretty much the same width as the opening itself. So if you have a wider pen, it's not going to be a good time. But here with this 80ml bottle, that's not an issue in any form. And with the larger bottle being a glass bottle with a wider base, it's going to stay upright much better than the plastic one. Speaking of filling, the pen that we're using for this review is my Moonman T1 that I picked up as a replacement for the TWSBI 580 Prussian Blue. I feel that this dark red ink is also a good match for the blue aluminum body, and with this fine nib, I think we're going to get a good look at what this ink has to offer. The first paper we're going to be looking at is Rhodia, and right off the bat, I can see why this ink is a little bit of a crowd favorite. From a fine nib, we're getting a nice bold burgundy, or at least what I would consider to be a burgundy. It also qualifies as a nice blood red, which sort of makes sense with a name like Oxblood. Side note, I do like that the color on the paper is matching what we have here on the label. Now, we'll take a look at the color profile a little bit later in the review, but on first blush, this ink starts off a nice mid-dark and just goes further from there. And this is from a fine nib. So two things writing with this ink on Rhodia is showing me, and that is, the first, this is a pretty well lubricated ink if it's coming out this bold. The second, I may actually end up keeping this bottle around, but that's really going to depend on the Rhodia dry time and the Tomoe performance, which as you can see here, this Rhodia dry time is on point with a very slight smear at 10 seconds and completely Sahara dry at 15. So before we look at the Tomoe performance, let's take a look at the potential range of this ink. Now, looking at the blot, I'm going to have to admit that I cheated to get the super light parts at the bottom. I think you would have to have either an EF or a UEF to see that from this ink. The rest of the blot though is pretty spot on. Like on the Rhodia sample, we start nice medium blood red and fade into the darker burgundy tones. I just need to find a combination that will give me that entire color gamut when I'm writing. Now moving on to Tomoe, we start seeing a lighter touch than we did on the Rhodia, and I feel we're getting more burgundy than blood red, which is to be expected on Tomoe, as this paper does tend to show off underlying properties of an ink much better than Rhodia does. Especially if you look back up at that ink blot, you can see now how the changing of the angle really changed the dynamic of the darker portions. Another difference I started to notice when I switched paper was that I'm actually getting a slightly thinner line on the Tomoe River. I was also expecting a complete opposite there, but I find myself pleasantly surprised. Also, like on the Rhodia, I'm finding no flow issues here, and the line is consistent without any skipping. As I'm going through the Quick Brown Fox, take a look at that finger smear. I didn't really smear it as much as I thought it would, so let's see how this dry time compares with what we saw in Rhodia. And I would actually say that this is more in line with Rhodia than what I normally expect when comparing the two papers. We're still functionally dry at 10 and completely dry at 15. So really the last thing we're going to want to look at here is the water performance. Now, with what we've gotten so far, this is really going to be the make or break point for me with this ink. Now, this writing sample was done about 10 minutes before we did the water test, so it's no surprise that we're losing the top layer. But how much of it are we really going to lose? After we go ahead and take the paper towel and get it nice and dried off, what we see here is a really good result. Sure, we lost some of the top layer, but we do have enough of a ghosting underneath that this is recoverable. And that is what's important. So this is probably going to be one of the quicker recaps that I've done. The only con I have is that I wish this ink gave us some more of the lighter reds. That said, moving on to the pros, I feel that we have a nice bold red that gives into that Oxblood moniker, or at least toys with burgundy. It's well behaved and lubricated for a smooth flow. The dry time is consistent and quick. The water performance is very good as well. And let's talk about that bottle. This has to be one of my favorite bottles out of all of them. I mean, okay, it's tied with the Pilot Iroshizuku bottles. But anyways, the value at $15 for 80 ml is really hard to ignore, and it makes this a good purchase. So my final thought is that this definitely deserves to be a community favorite. But that's it for this video. Don't forget to ink up that subscribe button, become a patron for early releases and extras, follow the channel on Twitter and Instagram, and remember, don't drink the ink.